slides. And I think everyone realizes that flood insurance and floodplains can be very confusing. And I've spent 30 plus years working in floodplains, and I'm still learning things every day. The flood insurance side is definitely the most confusing, but unfortunately, it's going to get even more so, or maybe less so. In October of 2021, there is a new premium rating system that's going to start. It's called Risk Rating 2.0. And I will touch on that a little bit in this presentation. But in general, every property will be individually rated. There still will be pre-firm and post-firm rates, basically homes built before there were maps, rated differently than homes built after there were flood insurance rate maps for our community. And one of the biggest changes is elevation certificates will no longer be required to rate a structure that was built after the flood insurance map for a community. They will still be recommended and still will probably provide someone with their best insurance rating, but they are now going to be using other tools like topography, street view. Rural communities, unfortunately, many times don't have street view options, but essentially they're going to try to use as many other tools as they can to rate a structure as accurately as they can without an elevation certificate. So here's some of the basic terms. Hopefully most of you recognize these. FEMA, of course, NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program, that's the federal flood insurance program. There is now private flood insurance that's available, and I'll touch on that later as well. I'll refer to things as being pre-firm and post-firm. So firm is the flood insurance rate map for a community, and I will discuss how you confirm the date of the first flood insurance rate map. Floodplains, there's multiple ways we refer to floodplains. Floodplain, regulatory floodplain, special flood hazard area, Zone A and Zone AE are the most typical, although there will be AH and AO zones as well. Those are areas of more of ponding. And then, not that any of you will experience it, but if you were ever a realtor for the lakefront along Lake Michigan, we are now going to have B zones, which is a coastal zone typically, but as we know from flooding along Lake Michigan and wave action that can occur, it does act like a coastal zone. Base flood elevation is the floodplain elevation. We often will call it a BFE, and that's the way it's, I don't know if it says that on the elevation certificate or not. I think it might call it the 100-year flood elevation. Elevation certificates, the form used typically to help rate an insurance for a structure built post-firm or after the first flood insurance rate map. And finally, a letter of map amendment, which is used to correct an error in the flood insurance rate map. So what is the National Flood Insurance Program? It's a voluntary program. Flood insurance is provided for property owners, businesses, residential, as well as renters, which is an underutilized flood insurance option. The underlying home owner doesn't have to have insurance for the renter to cover their contents. Improve floodplain management is one of the goals. And then they provide flood hazard zones, the floodplain maps, basically. To join, a community must adopt those maps and studies through an ordinance. So they adopt those regulations, along with adopting the map, and those regulations basically say they will not allow new structures to be built in the floodplain that are not elevated properly. And they have to enforce those regulations to protect new buildings and to prevent increased damages to existing buildings. Sorry about that. Not sure what happened. Oh, there we go. So like any insurance program, they have to define what they're going to cover. And so there is a definition of a flood, and it's the general or temporary condition of partial or complete flooding of 2 or more acres of normally dry land or 2 or more properties. So that can be your property, your neighbor's property, or it could be the right of way. And then this, to be a flood under the National Flood Insurance Program, the water must come over land, and it has to be an unusual or rapid accumulation. For example, ice jam flooding, which I know is experienced out your way. So it can't be something where, let's say, a lake level, like Lake Michigan, is no longer an unusual height. At some point, if there's a normal water level that's been achieved on a lake or on a river, they may at some point say, no, that is not an unusual water surface elevation. And then finally, mud flows, which generally don't happen here as often. It's not a landslide, but it would be actually just like flowing mud. So who can buy flood insurance? This is always still comes up, less and less, but it still comes up. Anyone can buy flood insurance if their community has adopted the maps and adopted an ordinance. So there are roughly 900 communities here in Illinois. We still have some counties in the state of Illinois and communities that have no flood insurance rate map. Macomb is an example of a community that does not have a flood insurance rate map. So, but anyone else can buy a policy in the NFIP if they're in one of those communities. Doesn't matter where you are. If you are not in the floodplain, you can get a lower premium. Often their policies are called preferred risk policies. Again, I mentioned renters can get them for contents only, and lenders require, generally must require building coverage only. So if you're ever working with someone and they're struggling to possibly pay their premium that's been quoted to them, they can request from the lender that they only cover the building coverage versus the replacement cost. It could affect them in the future if they were to have a large claim, but it might be what they need to help them get into the home. And they can also look at the deductibles. They now offer a $10,000 deductible. Non-primary homes or lakefront homes, river homes, secondary homes that someone might rent, those will pay a higher premium than someone's primary home. And rates are increasing annually by about 10%. But the non-primary homes can increase as much as 25% in a year, and those do go up quite a bit more every year. When can I file an NFIP claim? Well, basically it's going to be when the structure has been flooded by surface water. So it's got to come in through a window well, over the foundation, through a door window. Flood insurance does not pay if the structure is only flooded by the examples I give: sanitary backup, sump pump failure, or seepage into the basement, or groundwater infiltration. What does NFIP insurance cover in a basement? And I bring this up because, of course, in Illinois, most of our homes do have basements. And so you can get online, you can look look up better, more detailed information about this. But essentially, it's going to cover the foundation walls. I've had someone have bowing of their foundation wall, and they received money to put in an anchoring system for their foundation wall. It'll cover furnaces, some pumps in the basement, electrical boxes, water heaters, drywall for walls and ceilings if it's required by the code, not decorative if someone's just improved their basement. And then it does cover washers and dryers and food freezers. So NFIP insurance versus homeowner coverage. I'm just going to call out the two main points here is, again, limited basement coverage. But the biggest thing is flood insurance, it can't be canceled no matter how many claims you file. The NFIP coverage is not canceled. Homeowner coverage for basement flooding typically is a rider, and it would cover things like a sanitary backup or some pump failure. And I've heard of people having their insurance canceled after they've had multiple claims of basement flooding. And private companies, again, are starting to provide flood insurance, but everyone would have to read what their coverage is if someone chooses to go with a private company. And I have heard anecdotally of people getting private policies at a low premium, but as soon as they file a claim, the premium either is higher or matches what the NFIP coverage is. And one of the critical things is sometimes people are paying a subsidized rate through the federal National Flood Insurance Program. And if they leave and discontinue coverage, if they come back, they will lose that reduced rate. So they have to be very careful and speak with their agents before they discontinue coverage. If someone is purchasing a home and someone already has flood insurance coverage, they should have that policy converted to them. So again, there's no discontinuation of coverage. We want to keep continuous coverage if there's any kind of grandfathering happening on that premium. Again, just an example here of a basement that's clearly been improved, and those kind of improvements are not going to be covered. And of course, personal belongings are not covered in the basement. Do we have any questions before I move to the next?
There was one. In Macomb, does that mean there's no map for us to check for flood zone status? If so, how do we determine this for accurate MLS data input?
There is no map, correct. You could speak to, I don't know about the MLS input. I would assume you would have to say no map for this community. I will try to get an answer for that. And if the person wants to email me at the end, and if I do get something, I will let your association know, and they could let you guys know. Understanding the floodplain. So basically, just a quick picture here. You've got, a creek at normal flow. You've got this house sitting up on the top of the bluff, and now the second photo or second image, we're in flood stage. The floodplain has come up to its full extent, and within the center of that floodplain, we have what's called the floodway. So the floodway is part of the floodplain. We have higher regulatory standards in the floodway, and the goal is to not fill that center portion where the water depth is typically greater and velocities are higher, and a majority of the flood flow is contained within that floodway. So in this example, you can see that the house is just outside of the floodplain. A little deck post comes down to ground that's just higher than the floodplain. So now we're going to look at some maps and look at the different areas, floodplain areas defined on the map. So we have the blue shaded area is the zone A, the mapped floodplains. In this example, you can see an AE zone where elevations are defined, and then you have a small zone A off to the right side of the image where an elevation has not been defined. The base flood elevations are generally shown with those whole numbers in this older map here. And those cross sections, the letter G and H and F, those refer back to a flood profile where a detailed elevation to the 10th of a foot is provided. The base flood elevation shown here in the whole numbers are approximate and should not be used to define an elevation. An engineer or surveyor needs to look at a flood insurance study that accompanies the maps to get an accurate flood elevation for a structure. The floodway here is, as you can see, is almost entirely and in some areas it is entirely the floodplain for the zone AE, and it's the area that's cross-hatched with the white lines. The unnumbered zone A, again on the right, does not have a floodway defined. So there's no elevation defined and there's no floodway defined. We typically consider then the entire zone A to be floodway because it's unstudied at this point. Community numbers are listed. In this case, the example is Manuka, and at the bottom right corner, you can see the community number is shown there. Zone X is the unshaded area, but then there's also what's called a shaded zone X, which is the 500-year floodplain, and that is only showed for critical facilities. Because we have regulations that prohibit hospitals or nursing homes, police stations, for example, to even be built in the 500-year. This is an example of a zone AH, which occurs there in the East Moline area. So this is a ponding area between the levees. And so there's just a set elevation defined. Just realized, and when I clipped this out, it doesn't have the leader that says zone AH, but the little area there defined in blue, the floodplain between the levees, just has a set elevation. And then you will see this black pixelated area here, and it's a special zone X because this is an area that's protected by a levee. And so I've highlighted the larger note that accompanies this. So that area, if that levee were to be breached, would flood. And of course, possibly, let's say the north levee is breached or fails. And so just the area there to the north would flood versus the areas to the south might stay dry in that situation. Here's an example of a floodplain, or the way the flood insurance rate maps look in Rock Island. I did Whiteside County. I unfortunately got information on the counties you guys serve right after I'd finished putting this together. But this is typical of the way your floodplain maps look. And so this is a zone AE floodplain, but note it does not have a floodway. Again, we then interpret the entire thing as a floodway. You can see on the north side of Rock Creek, there is a levee shown here. However, it is not, doesn't protect to the 100-year flood, and therefore the area behind the levee is still shown as floodplain. If you go to what's called the National Flood Hazard Layer, and I'm going to take you through, I believe I'll take you through an example, but you can type or Google FEMA National Flood Hazard Layer, and this is the kind of map you will see. And so the shadings are different than what you would see if you're looking at the actual flood insurance rate map, but it all represents the same information. So what we show here is, this is interesting. The levee protected area is this gray and beige striped area. And for some reason, it's only showing it to the south. This is the shaded X zone or the 500 year. So it's possible maybe that this levee is higher. Not really sure. I'll have to find out why that is here. We've got the floodway is shown in the blue and red cross hatching now. You can just see the aerial image underneath is much cleaner and clearer. Here is a zone AH, and it calls out an elevation of 573. So this entire area has a flood zone of 573. And this area in here has an elevation of 569. And the actual river itself is showing as having a flood elevation of 572.6. Oh, and these newer maps, you can see now they actually give the elevations on the cross sections. So you can read that to the 10th of a foot. Scott County, Iowa, which I believe you guys might also work in Iowa. They are getting all new maps coming March of 2021. So they will, their actual paper firm maps will look like this, which is what the National Flood Hazard Layer website shows. All right, any questions yet?
Yes, one person asked, how is floodway versus floodplain determined?
So every state defines it differently. In the state of Illinois, our floodways are defined based on a 1/10 of a foot rise. And I might show that essentially in the computer modeling, they take imaginary walls and start constricting the floodplain until the elevation of the water increases by a 1/10 of a foot, and then they stop. In other parts of the country, they will let it go up as much as 1 foot. And so the idea being, if we allowed people to fill along the edges of the floodplain until all the fringed area, the area outside of the floodway, were all filled in, we would increase the water only by a 1/10 of a foot. Illinois also requires 90% of the volume of water to also be stored. So it kind of gets complicated. But in general, Illinois' floodways, when they are defined, are much wider than they might be in other parts of the country. I think some states have a 1/2 a foot, allow for a 1/2 a foot increase. The National Flood Insurance Program, FEMA's regulations or federal regulations allow it only to be a foot, but we can be more restrictive than the federal regulations. All right, so am I in a floodplain? That's really probably the biggest question you guys have. So there are essentially three, oh, I should have updated this. There are three online sources generally you can refer to: the FEMA Map Service Center, which I'm going to show here in a minute, the National Flood Hazard Layer Viewer, which I've mentioned, and many county GIS viewers are now starting to add this information. I don't know about your counties and whether they have this or not for their county websites. So FEMA Flood Map Service Center. You can just Google that phrase and it'll send you here. And this is the welcome page, and you can just enter in an address and hit search, or you can choose the search all products. And in that case, you can choose through these drop-down menus to choose a jurisdiction. So I've got Illinois, Grundy County, Braceville. Here in this example, if you know that a property has a letter of map amendment and you want to get a copy of that and you have the case number, you can enter that right in here and then you can directly get that. So here's an example where I put in this property here in Joliet, Illinois, which is in Will County, of course. You guys probably know that. So you can choose here the flood map for the selected area. It tells you the panel, tells you the effective date, and you could click right here and get a map image to actually download that panel, or you can click here and get a miniature version of the map called a fermet. If a community has digital maps, then you also are seeing down below here what you would see on the National Flood Hazard Layer. Oops, hold on a second. So this is what the National Flood Hazard Layer map would look like, and you can go directly to the National Flood Hazard Layer viewer from the FEMA Map Service Center if a community has digital maps. Some areas of the state, like I said, don't have maps, or they are still on paper maps. And if an area is on paper maps, the image would just show green dots across it, meaning there is no map to view. Okay. So in this case, I selected the National Flood Hazard Layer viewer. Now I can zoom in and get, it puts a little dot here. In this case, I just want to always make sure, if I don't know where the property is, that I go into maybe the county GIS and confirm exactly that this is accurate. And unfortunately, the National Flood Hazard Layer does not give street names, which is really makes it difficult sometimes to find properties. But hopefully, as a realtor, you know exactly where it is and you know that that's the correct building. So when you're on the National Flood Hazard Layer, you can actually turn on all the LOMAs in an area now. So in the top right corner, there's a stack of papers and it's the layer list. You can turn that on. You will get a box here called NFHL, or National Flood Hazard Layer Viewer. You click on the triangle here. And so in this case, I clicked on it and it shows you there's a drop-down menu of what you can choose, and you turn on the LOMAs. It is not turned on because otherwise it's just too much data until you zoom in closer. So now you can see all the different letters of map amendment that have been issued. So there are a number of homes here that sit on higher ground, and they were able to be shown to be above the flood elevation. I believe the next slide I'm going to show you, but you can now click on this purple dot. It will open up a box and you can actually directly print this LOMA if you're looking for it. So here's, oops, Not sure. Oh, there we go. So when I turned on the Loma layer, that house that I was interested in, which had the floodplain just touching the outside of the house, turns out they actually have a Loma. So I can see it right here. So if you're working with someone, you can tell them that this FEMA has issued a letter, and you can click on this and print it for them. So FEMA has said that the structure is out. So again, just explaining that letters of map amendment are a way for FEMA to correct an error in the map. And if a house is sitting or a building is sitting on higher ground, the LOMA or letter of map amendment is the process to get FEMA to issue a correction. Here's an example of another LOMA here in Joliet. So here's the case number I was referring to that you could have put into the FEMA Map Service Center to pull up this letter, or you can go to the National Flood Hazard Layer. So it is a LOMA. It is a determination of removal. And in this case, they, in my opinion, were smart, and they had the whole property removed. They didn't just turn in an elevation certificate. They actually submitted topographic information or spot elevations for the property that said that the lowest grade elevation on the lot was 546.1, and that's 0.2 of a foot higher than the base flood elevation. Here's another example of a LOMA. Again, it's a removal, but in this case, they only remove the structure. I don't know if I don't show it, but if, I'm gonna go back. Sometimes a LOMA letter will be issued, and the property owner really needs to look at it. It will say non-removal here, and it will say LOMA-DEN for denied. I don't know why, but people will submit for LOMAs when the lowest adjacent grade of the home is lower than the base flood elevation. And so FEMA has issued a denial in that case. If a letter is denied on the National Flood Hazard Layer, it will still appear, but instead of being the pretty purple dot, it will be a brown dot that will show that it has been denied. It is not a approved LOMA. So the other option we talked about using the search all products. You can search all products for a community. So in this example, you put in the state, the county, the community, you hit search, and you will get this menu down here. So there are 30 flood insurance rate map panels for the city of Joliet. Here's the flood insurance study, which is what the engineer or surveyor would use to actually read an accurate base flood elevation. And there are 12 what we call letters of map change. So if you were to select that letters of map change, you will see here that there are 10 LOMAs that are active. And Joliet got new maps in 2019. And so what happens, like what's going to happen for Scott County, Iowa, is they're going to have the old letters of map amendments and old letters of map revision that were issued before the new maps. So prior to March of 2021, any letter of map amendment or letter of map revision that was issued has to be revalidated. Or in some cases, if a new study was done and flood elevations went higher, some of those will not be revalidated. So if someone has an old letter of map amendment, these two letters here, so you can select the revalidation arrow, and then you can download these letters. And in these letters, there will be a list of all the revalidated LOMAs. Should become up. So here is the example. So again, I said they got their new maps in February of 2019. And so these cases are from 2011. And so in order for them to still be valid, they have to be revalidated. And so this letter might be needed by a lender, by their flood determination company. They should know how to find all this. Those flood determination companies are getting better at it. But this is how you verify, if necessary, that a letter is still valid. All right. Oh, I do show a denial. So here's the example of a letter of map amendment. It's from 2008. And you can see that the color here is brown. When you go to select the download, I show that. Okay, I'm showing you here. It has brown, contact community. And when you actually print this, you can see that it's denied up here. So it's no longer valid. And it was the structure. So the annual chance flood here is 515, and their lowest adjacent grade was 0.4 of a foot below. And this one might have just been denied without a new map. They just, I don't know why their surveyor submitted information clearly showing they were in the floodplain. Any other questions? Oh, Kathy drinking.
Yeah, we have 3 questions. The first one is, what significance do the different elevations mean?
So if your ground is 700 and the floodplain adjacent to your structure is 698, then you are 2 feet above that base flood elevation. And, you know, you could apply for a LOMA. You can use a topographic survey to show that you're not in the floodplain, and what part of your property is not in the floodplain, and then you can develop on it. If the property that you have, the ground around the home or the ground for the property is, let's say, elevation 695, and the base flood elevation is 700, you're 5 feet below. So that property has a flood depth of 5 feet. So if you have a home at grade, then that home has a 5 feet on the first floor. And if you have a basement that's 8 feet deep, that bottom level is 13 feet below the flood elevation. So you look to the floodplain, that's elevation that's essentially, if you were to cut a cross section of the river, or draw a line from your house to the river, what is the elevation that they say it is flooding there? Typically on the bigger rivers, it tends to be a more flat floodplain, but as you get into smaller creeks that are steeper, the flood elevation can change quite drastically. And roads typically form dams, and that's so the overtopping elevation of that road is sometimes what sets an elevation for anything upstream of that road. And so the flood elevation can change quite a bit on smaller streams. Any other question?
Yep, the next one is, Macomb has no official flood maps. Does this mean the homes there cannot be flood insured by NFIP?
I can't recall if they're in an emergency program there or not. I'm sorry. They are in the process of getting new maps in Macomb. So all of that county is getting maps. Trying to remember how long it is until they get new maps, but I believe they can enter as an emergency program. And so they do have the ability to get flood insurance. I'm actually have an email that I owe to Macomb because they are looking to adopt an ordinance. But I don't believe right now they are in, so only private insurance would be available. But again, lenders won't find a map, so the lenders aren't going to be requiring insurance because right now there is no map for them to look to know whether there's a risk.
And the last question you answered, it was, will the map show if a property was turned down for the LOMA? And you just answered that just a minute ago.
Yeah, so the denial, right.
Yep.
And if there are older LOMAs that were not revalidated because they're no longer valid, this typically happens when a new flood insurance map is issued and some of those streams are restudied. And unfortunately, our rainfall is changing and we, in general, are seeing more rain per year. And so when streams are restudied, like almost always the flood elevation will increase. So sometimes old letters of map amendment will be denied revalidation with the new mapping. So how does flood insurance work? Like I mentioned, it is confusing. And now we're gonna enter into a new phase later this year. We're hopeful that it will benefit the Midwest in general. This new risk rating 2.0, what they've told us is the intention is to put coastal communities that have been seeing sea level rise and increase in hurricanes, that they will be paying more of their fair share. In general, the premiums paid in Illinois have gone to subsidize claims in Florida, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and the East Coast. So pretty much if it's a 4-walled structure, it can be insured by the NFIP. If it's an elevated structure, it can be insured under the NFIP. This structure here on the left that's being elevated, or really all of them, if they're in the floodplain, they are required flood insurance. The premium paid for an elevated structure is lower than had it not been elevated, but it still does require flood insurance. That's kind of a joke that my boss put up, but I guess technically you could elevate. Don't know that that would meet any of our building codes, but and even the largest government buildings can get covered for National Flood Insurance Program. So you guys know this, who must buy flood insurance? Buildings, mobile homes in a special flood hazard area that are used as security for a loan. So the bank essentially is loaning them money, and their house is the security. And so the federal law says you lender must require flood insurance if that structure is at risk. And so those are federally backed loans. Oh, there we go. Designated loans in a federally backed loan. So if it's private funding, you got money from grandma, no one's going to make you carry flood. Grandma's not going to make you carry flood insurance. But if you have a federally backed loan, it will be required if you're in the floodplain. How much coverage? We talked a little bit about this. It's usually the lesser amount of the outstanding principal or the maximum amount available under the NFIP. Private insurance carriers now may, of course, offer higher insurance, and really that's been the case for like Lloyd's of London, for example. You could have gotten a policy through them if you had $1 million home, because the maximum coverage for a residential is $250,000. And in commercial, it's $500,000 under the NFIP. So now I'm going to do, wow, we're running out of time. So now I'm going to do a quick comparison of the costs. So in a pre-firm structure, they are paying the same amount regardless of whether the house is a foot above, a foot below, or 10 feet below the base flood elevation. So these are just examples of a slab foundation home. And so these pre-firm rates are consistent across all three homes. And these numbers are just for purpose of discussion. In general, rates have increased. These probably are more like $3,000 a year now, rather than the 887. Was for a based on a $75,000 building. So it's probably more like 1,100 a year now. I worked with homes that were worth about 170,000, and they were paying something on the order of 5,000 a year. And they had, they were probably 9 or 10 feet below the base flood elevation. So now we're going to compare that with post-firm homes in the same situation. So this would be a case where a home is being built, newly built, and the local community is not properly requiring it to be elevated. So we have the first house, it's going to be a foot above, and they're going to be paying about $535 a year. So you can see that the pre-firm home in this situation, it would be worth it for them to go to the post-firm rates. They would actually pay less than they're paying at their pre-firm rates because they are above the floodplain. Now, the second house is a foot below, and because it was built out of compliance, it will be paying $3,000 a year compared to the pre-firm home in the same situation. So this is why a local community, they aren't enforcing their regulations. The homeowner or building owner is going to pay the price of their not doing their proper review of the construction for the home. And then the horrible situation where we have a home built with, in general, a basement, so they're 10 feet below. Their premiums now on the order of like $20,000 a year. And I have met people who are paying those kind of premiums. So what is pre-firm? Again, it's a structure built before the first flood map for a community, typically late 70s or early 80s. That's not always the case, such as Macomb is going to be getting new maps. So here are two examples from Whiteside County, where Fulton entered in 82, but these three other communities entered in 2011. And I'm going to show you where to get this table. At the bottom, it's on the flood insurance rate map index panel. So the very first map in the set of the flood insurance maps. And so you can see here this column that says initial firm date. Okay. And this shows the date that they entered the National Flood Insurance Program. So Macomb could enter, like I said, in an emergency program, and they have separate insurance rates for communities in the emergency phase. So Albany joined back in 1974, but they actually didn't get a map until 7 years later. So how do I find this pre-firm date? Again, you're going to go through the Map Service Center, search all products. This gets you to the actual maps for a community. So I chose the village of Shanahan and Grundy, and here's their effective products, which are the maps. So I selected that, and the very first map is the index panel. And you can click over here to view it. Okay, and then here's the table that I was referring to. So you find it on this index panel. And there's the list. So you can see the initial firm date. Again, it's usually the 80s, but here we have diamond only came in 2012. That's when this map was issued for Grundy County. And you can see the other dates are generally in the 80s. So here's the new firm maps for Scott. And I added this slide. When a area is newly mapped, so here's an example where the current map for Scott County looks like this. It's not very clear. There, you can't see the houses. You just have this general floodplain through here. You can see the shape of it. If you go to the National Flood Hazard layer, it shows that same shape. And so you can see these five houses here would roughly be shown as out. Although since this is an unstudied floodplain, they probably should have all been required flood insurance by a lender. Again, you have houses down here shown as out, and then over here, this house is shown to be in. I put a dashed line here to reflect the location of the actual creek, so you can see when you got across the road, the floodplain really didn't follow the creek very well. So this is the new map coming in March of 21. The floodplain is more centered on the creek. And here's this cul-de-sac here. And this house is now clearly shown out, whereas before it was in, looked to be in. And the water comes around the back of these homes. And before it clipped this home, and now this home is more or less shown out. But probably the biggest change is on the west side of the street on Hickory and Sheridan. We clearly now have all these homes right on the floodplain. So they should be trying to determine a flood elevation for this floodplain and trying to get themselves letters of map amendment. May require them to do a study and work together. But because they are newly mapped, they actually get a slightly cheaper flood insurance rate, but they must get that policy within the first year of this map. So by March of 2022, that reduced rate goes away. If any of them get a map or get a flood insurance policy, at this point, they'd have to get it today. If they can get a policy before this map goes effective, then they actually can extend that reduced rate for even another year. But it's critical that they at least get the policy within the first year, if not immediately, to hold on to the cheapest flood insurance rates they can. And that's the newly rated procedure or newly mapped procedure. Sorry, I should say mapped here. And many insurance agents don't know about it. And it is a new form or a different form when they apply for that insurance. And they have to know to use that form. Okay, 5 minutes. I don't know how many slides I have left. So elevation certificate prepared by a land surveyor documents the elevation of the structure compared to the base flood elevation or floodplain elevation. Right now, it's required for all post-firm structures to get their policy, flood insurance policy. Again, it's not going to be required after October of 2021. Used to apply for a LOMA to get the structure removed. And like I said, with that house that was 1 foot above the floodplain that was built pre-firm, right now, if they want to reduce their flood insurance rate, they could submit an elevation certificate and get a post-firm rate that's cheaper. This is just some section of the form where you put in the community name and community number, the county name, and then this is where the information goes for the from the floodplain map, the flood zone. This is the way the building elevation information is provided. Generally, they're done for finished construction, but lenders sometimes or should require flood insurance if they've given a construction loan. And so elevation certificates can be completed based on the construction drawings or the building under construction. So they're going to give the top of the bottom floor, including the basement or the bottom of a crawl space, the next higher floor, attached garage, and let's see, the lowest elevation of machinery or equipment. So if the air conditioner is not elevated properly, that is going to affect the insurance rate. Finally, they'll give the lowest ground elevation next to the building and the highest ground elevation next to the building. If this lowest ground elevation is below the base flood elevation, that will put the structure in because water is touching that structure. And then finally, we have the elevation of the decks or stairs. And I'm going to show another slide on how that can impact a house. So here's a house. Maybe the first floor of this house is fine. It's above the floodplain elevation, but because they cantilevered this deck over the water, the elevation now that affects whether this house is or is not in the floodplain is the ground elevation here at these deck posts. Assuming this deck has been built and it's bolted into the house like a traditional deck, then that deck is part of the house. And if it were to be pulled off of the house by a flood, let's say large debris came down and pulled that away from the house, it would damage the house. So that elevation is the elevation that could put the house into the floodplain. If this deck was not connected and it was a freestanding deck, could be touching the house, it's just not bolted to the house. A surveyor can note that and provide pictures in the elevation certificate to explain that the deck is not part of the house. Just a couple really quick slides here. Flood damage claims in Illinois, 92% are outside of the MAP floodplain. We have a lot of urban flooding happening in Illinois, a lot of intense rainfall and urban street flooding. And of course, we still have communities with old maps or no maps, and so they don't really reflect the risk. Essentially, we know our climate is changing, and despite better maps and stronger regulations, we are still seeing flood damages. This shows that our annual rainfall now in Illinois has increased 4.5 inches since the early 1900s. And we are just seeing more of these intense rainfall years lately. National Climate has predicted that we will have a 31% increase here in the upper Midwest for rainfall or heavy precipitation. So summary, I'll let you guys read this. I know you all should have received the PDF. Is there any other questions?
There are a couple here. My home was built at a pre-firm date. How do I qualify for a post-firm insurance rate?
So every insurance agent is supposed to check what's the best rate for you. So if you want to get an elevation certificate, you can submit that to have a new rating done. Probably best if you just contact me with an email and I can look at our state elevation information so I can try to help you make that determination. But in October of 2021, we have these new rates coming. So depending on when your policy renews, you should be getting a new review of your policy at that time, and your rating should adjust and give you the better rating because they're going to be evaluating your policy now individually. But please just send me an email and we can discuss offline your details.
Okay, and another question was, will properties that were not previously in a flood zone, but now will they be considered in the zone after the new maps? Will they be sent a letter?
So lenders are told when new maps are coming out, and they are supposed to check their portfolio, basically on an annual basis to make sure that maps have not changed for their lending portfolio. I've heard that depending on the timing, some lenders aren't catching these map changes until that full year has passed. And so that's what's really unfortunate. If the community did not reach out to their residents and do a lot of public outreach to explain to them that the maps were changing, and I've been there, I had to tell 180 people that their maps, that they were going to be mapped in, and it's painful. It's time consuming, and they yell at you. And so some community officials, they don't want to do it. And in the time of COVID, public outreach and public hearings, they're harder to hold. And I don't know that people are participating as much. So yes, eventually it will catch up to anyone who's newly mapped in, if they have a federally backed loan. But whether it will happen within the year and they miss that opportunity to get the newly mapped procedure, I can't guarantee that.
Well, thank you so much, Marilyn. It was a really
All right.
informative class, and thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate you keeping your people involved and letting your homeowners know updated information. And thank you, Marilyn.
Yeah, so here's my contact information. Sorry, I should have switched to this, but hopefully everyone got the PDF, and they can contact me. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Bill.